a bit contradictory about how great an extent women participated in the less structured activity, apart from being spectators. That is, some writers will say men dress as women, women dress as men, as if that is fairly equal. Others refer in detail to the men dressing as women, but have very few references to women dressing as men. And normally then, prostitutes are an important group because they are always being caught and punished in Rome for having dared to mask and dress as men. They aren't supposed to take part in the way that respectable women can. My impression is then twofold, that as far as formal proceedings are concerned, women have rather a small part, but as far as the informal proceedings are concerned, the part that they had means more to them because they are more restricted normally. Just being able to go about the streets without an escort is such a big thing for them. As to the transvestism, well, one presumes that for a small minority of the population, these conventions might afford an extra pleasure, but I'd be very suspicious of any attempt to do a psychoanalytical interpretation of the fact that most Venetians are dressing up in this way. I think that would be a confusion of public and private symbolism.
I think it was the French film, and in your essay, they referred to the fact that it didn't matter at all what the disguise was, as long as the person was unrecognisable. And so I'm wondering whether we ought to attach too much importance to specific forms of disguise rather than to the general fact of disguise.
That suggests something about the size of the community in which these practices were generated, doesn't it? Because there's no point in wearing a mask if you're in the city of London today. Presumably, therefore, the conventions of disguise originally make sense in the context where everyone is immediately recognised as not disguised. Is that so?
Yes, or at least can be conventionally understood to be not recognised.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily so. I noticed in one of the papers they comment that they didn't wear disguise on a certain occasion, but that was because the ritual took place at night. Well, actually, that doesn't necessarily follow at all. Certainly not in African context, either urban or tribal. It doesn't follow that people don't wear masks or disguise at night. And as a matter of fact, just to go back to the float, as it happens in the East African cities, the floats were modelled upon village, if you want to call them that, tribal up-country rituals in connection with initiation, because slaves had brought to the coast the idea of these bamboo-style frames, which at night looked like elephants and other marvellous things. And the name given to the floats in the Swahili cities was the same name as had been given to these up-country initiation rites, which is a nice movement from the country to the town. I would have thought it was actually very important to look at what people are wearing, because if one's looking at participation in Carnival as a series of messages, clearly it's not only what you sing and what you say, but how you look and what you do, which makes it so difficult for the historian to decode the greater part of the messages. But one of the things is the costumes that people wear, the element of fashion, the historical reference, which clearly are in fact there in European Carnival. I think it's very important indeed to classify these. If I may just, while I'm talking, come back to the question of the float. It's not only the expense of the float, I think, that one needs to know, but I doubt myself whether the float itself is just there like that. The float is presumably presented by a particular group who are the clients of, or who are the denizens of a particular road, and who consume wine and whose expenses in these wider ways are paid for perhaps by a patron, perhaps by themselves. It's those kind of representative and economic factors that one needs to look at, as well as the more specific expense.
There was a float with a witch in one of the Spanish ones, wasn't there? I can't. That seems to be more than reflect a general consensus rather than a specific family.
But in any case, it appears that there is a specific male-female aspect to these carnivals. I mean, whether you, it's not really a question of a disguise First is in the form of males taking on female attack. But not only that, there is also a certain form of address towards the female population in the way of obscenity, rival songs, obscenity and all that. And if we take the two things together, obviously, it seems to me that a particular male gesture is being made to, in the first place, the female population, and possibly eventually to the community as a whole. I don't know how to explain this, but one can see again as a universal that this occurs in your culture area, it occurs in Kim Marriott's Indian village too. And one obvious explanation is, of course, to try and interpret this in terms of role reversal, rebellion, safety valve sort of way. I don't know what to, how I've been trying to sort of grapple with this one in terms of what Freud has to say about obscenity, obscene language, in his famous work on jokes. Now, you'll recall that Freud says that it is not enough for the male to have an illicit kind of desire for the female. It is important for him to verbalize this. But if he verbalizes this, just the female concerned, he might produce exactly the opposite of what he desires. The female will probably, thanks to her natural modesty, rebuff the male. And therefore Freud goes on to suggest, I find the suggestion full of sort of meaning at various levels, that smut, he actually calls it smut, smut involves three parties. The male, the female to whom the smut is addressed, and a third party. Now, Freud's explanation, you'll recall, is this, that the female resists obscene language and obscene suggestions, and therefore the male perpetrator of the obscenity must get an ally of his own sex, or a number of them, to support him in this, asking them to witness his act, and thereby, to the extent that others witness his act or hear it, they become party to it. And therefore, by, in a way, smearing the conscience of the onlooker or of the audience outside the two, that is the male and the female, the perpetrator of the obscene joke, of smut, involves the entire community. Now, I have a feeling that it's quite possible that obscenity, and I will take for the moment transvestism as a form of obscenity, as against verbal obscenity, which comes in the form of rival songs and jokes and so on and so forth. I'll call it iconic obscenity. It's seen. Now, there are two forms of obscenity, one that is heard, one that is seen. And by this obscenity, a dialectical process is achieved. At the moment that the male population addresses themselves in terms of iconic or verbal obscenity towards the female population, the community is divided. Secondly, the male population, by the very fact that they are perpetrating an obscenity, they involve the rest of the community as onlookers and as hearers in this act. So, by the second stage of the act, they unite the community in spite of the fact that one half of the community is being addressed and attacked by the obscenity. This is the only way I can explain this as having some kind of a function, and this is the only way I can figure it as a structure within the sort of thing. It is an act that, by dividing the community between the sexes, unites it in terms of the relationship between those who utter smart or perpetrate obscenity and those who are onlookers or hearers as a community.
You mean the dirty jokes, as it were, always get an audience?
Well, I mean, as I just explained.
The audience of the sort of public setting carnival.
I wanted to just check my ethnographic memory, which is now 20 years out of date. My memory of life in an Indian village, in terms of obscenity in this public form, was seemed more directed from women to men. That is, if you think of the situation in wedding parties at certain occasions, I mean, and in Holi as well. It's not just Holi, but I can remember almost any time the women in the village went out anywhere as a group, not as individuals, and they came back and the men were watching, they were frequently singing ribald songs, both personal to certain men as well as very general ones.
I think if we just had a break just for a second, because you've been going for an hour and a quarter, and this would be
just to take up this point, if I may, I have a feeling that this is
they say off the record. Say what you like.
No, I have a feeling that this will really back up my case in the sense that is the redundancy. That you do this in the case of Holi or other festivals. You also do it in certain kinds of marriage ceremonies, as you say, and other things. That instead of the males addressing themselves as females, you do it the reverse. But the dialectic of it, as I understand it, that it divides in order to unite.
Right.
Well,
your basic point I accept.
Yeah.
No,
And it will be, in fact, that kind of example is very good. It's a redundancy. It will simplify the support and reinforce the.
But I think an important thing is apparent here in these cross-cultural comparisons that I kept on noticing in the films. And when we're talking, we briefly said this morning, what is public ritual? And if you mean ritual on the streets and in the squares, then in a Southern European Catholic culture or an East African Islamic culture, you're not going to get women participating in public ritual, even if it's anarchic rites of reversal. There are limitations on anarchic rites of reversal. However, if it's not either of those cultures, you get women freely participating in public ritual. Now, meanwhile, the question is, what are women doing in Southern European towns or in Islamic towns? In Islamic towns, as I discovered to my astonishment, I having studied the male public ritual and written a book about it, one of my graduate students studied the female ritual which was going on in the compounds, the courtyards, and in the interlinked network of houses in Malmö. You can move from one to the other without going into the streets, the way that they're built. And she had come up with a whole network of female dance associations and poetic associations competing with each other. She had no notion, because she only talked to women, that they were the female wing of my associations. I had no notion, because I only talked to men, that there was. When you put the two together, you saw that in fact the female competitive activity behind doors was a part of, and just as important as, the male competitive activity in the streets. Now, I don't know whether there's any parallel in Southern Europe or not.
Well, I was thinking of what you had in your piece about compartmentalistic the association of men and women in the godparent relation. I mean,
yes,
these were. I mean, there was the verse that you have. It was a festival for women, and this was expressed. And if you didn't get a boyfriend at this time, you'd have to wait until the next time round. There seems to be some connection with the points that you've been.
Yes, well, the comparative carnival were either made by lot. There were games of chance you could play, rather like Paul James's, which we used to dance in our childhood, whereby they were thrown, boy and girl were thrown together by chance, and after that they went on as compadre and as compadre and comadre. And I think also they were made by agreement as well. But certainly I had the impression that within Carnival, men disguised as women is much more common than women disguised as men, and in all the instances I can think of, it was always the men disguised as women, whether in Mexico or in Spain, and even in those inversionary rites, like the Lady Mary's of Tumalamara, which Cairo has written about, although they are given the wands of authority and appointed in authority for the day, they are not disguised as men. They are disguised in very traditional, very beautiful female clothing, and they are put in command as women. I don't know whether anybody has data on women disguised as men in Carnival. I'd be interested.
I think that
there's lots of notions of it.
Yes, and Fynes
in
Morrison, in
general.
his account of Italian Carnival, certainly says it was common for both sexes to change dress, and of course women rioters sometimes dressed as men and male rioters as women, which brings me on rather to, I'd like, if I may, since we are still on, to change the subject a little and to move on to the question of what are the limits to Carnival. We keep agreeing that there are limits, you can't go beyond a certain point and so on. What are those points and why are they what they are? Terence, you most recently referred to this. Would you like to?
I don't think that I got a very great deal to say about. See, we're constantly moving to and fro in a fruitful way, I think, from the specific European cases, which both the papers refer to the wider reference. And I don't feel at all qualified to suggest what the limits were in the specific European cases. I think all I'd say is once again to come back to this question of the balance, the organisation, the patronage, the movement out of popular carnival of the ruling classes and so forth. In my own examples, the limits of carnival change quite considerably when that occurs in these Swahili towns, when carnival, in the sense that I'm talking about, the processions through the streets and the competitive element in it, has been fitted into the overall dualistic character of the town, and so each carnival group is headed by and gives its fealty to the aristocratic families who represent that part of the town. During these periods you have indeed sort of rituals of inversion and so on, but you certainly have no effective proletarian challenge to the overall structures of the city, either in verse or in action. Now, as late as the 20th century, in this particular instance, you get the ruling groups withdrawing, and curiously enough it's largely connected with a kind of Islamic bourgeois ethic against waste and expenditure. Then, defiantly, the sailors and porters and so on form their own association and say, we are as good as any Arab, we can raise money ourselves, we'll show them, we'll make it even more splendid. And you begin to get really, not class-conscious songs, because that isn't a class situation still, but you begin to get really abrasive anti-aristocracy, anti-Arab definitions of what Malmö civilization is like. Something very much more polarized, and something which is sort of redefining the limits of expression during Carnival.
I'll ask Keith, actually, if he would elaborate a little. I mean, you were thinking of what disguises in Rebecca, right?
Yes.
The sky and the shift from male-female clothing. If I could just push it to a point that you made earlier about masks being disguised, because in these cases, I mean, people weren't concealing their faces, whether they were just shifting their clothing. Well, I want to ask that. I mean, you made this interesting point about the town and country, and in this sense, when I've seen masking, by and large, it really concealment of the total personality really has not been the main aim of it. I mean, I think most people, except perhaps young children, when I've seen masked dancers of various kinds, I mean, have known that A, these are human beings that are there, and B, they've probably known the human beings themselves. I was reminded actually recently, looking in the Volksmuseum in Vienna, where there was some pictures of from 1910 of some of these Pechten drama plays that were being formed. British. And now, you know, they have these elaborate masks here, but all their own clothes down here, and you can obviously tell from their boots and things like this who the chef was. In any case, it was a small area. I mean, they weren't being totally concealed. In this case, it reminds me of, I mean, there are a lot of things that are happening with masks. In this place, they were frightening children. They're in a, like an initiatory rite. I mean, the children were scattered, were scattering around. But anyone else, you know, would know who they were. I mean, they weren't actually concealing their total personality in that way. And perhaps sometimes the most important part of masking is the revelation and not the, you know, not the sort of continued disguise.
I always thought Father Christmas was rather letting the side down if he showed his boots. But on the more serious point,
yes.
what I was wondering was this more general tendency of the imagery of Carnival to carry over into movements of popular protest or sedition. This is a well-known feature of Europe in the 17th and 18th century.
Are there instances of actual rebellions sort of emerging out of it?
Yes,
And the Carnival of Roman in the 1580s was thought one of the best known French examples, but it certainly isn't the only one.
But that's a religious massacre, isn't it?
It begins as a carnival, it ends as a massacre, which some people interpret as class war, other people as faction fighting, and others as religious. And there are only three primary sources, and they contradict one another on this. But anyway, what began as a carnival mock battle ended with the peasants being, as one source says, massacred like pigs.
It's quite clear if you adopt a safety valve theory of these kind of things, or a Richard or Baron idea, the damn thing's not going to work every time. I mean, sometimes the safety valve's not going to work, the kettle's going to blow out. I mean, it's intrinsic part of the development thesis.
The theory is always...
He didn't argue himself.
No, in fact, it contradicts something at least.
It does. I mean, it's...
The Jews, after all, are there presumably as an enemy body within the Christian community, and they're being made to run naked through the streets or whatever.
Yes, I'm sure that would fit the Ranjit interpretation. Community solidarity is reaffirmed by this attack on the outsider.
What did you represent usually as well?
And all sorts of other things. There's a phrase in one of the Roman carnivals, these two-footed beasts are going to have their race. So they are seen as non-human.
But if one comes back again, as I'm sorry to keep on doing, to organisation, I mean, this is another element in it. Carnival is a way of getting people together. I'm thinking of the colonial authorities, who of course were enormously suspicious of any kind of organised manifestation, no matter what it was, but with some justification, because it's very difficult for an outsider to tell whether people are gathering together to perform a harmless ritual, or whether they're gathering together under the cloak of performing a harmless ritual. And I still don't know quite, and I don't know whether my parallels are parallel or not. I don't know what forms of organisation underlie Carnival in these Renaissance cities, but certainly in the cases that I'm thinking of, these do constitute, in a sense, companies where there are officers with hierarchies, which can, under certain circumstances, be mobilised, usually to fight each other, like the Reds and the Blues and the Greens in Rome or whatever it was. They usually fight each other, but one can never tell where this is going to lead and where that kind of contestation may go. So that I think that if one thinks of it in terms of organisation and however temporary bonds of relationship and some kind of partly mimic but partly real hierarchical structure. As people have said in the papers, I remember, that Carnival is a way of affirming a desire for equality in a genuinely hierarchical structure. Actually, it seems to me often Carnival imposes its own hierarchical structure, or within it has a hierarchical structure, which seems merely mimic, but in fact is real and gives prestige and gives authority.
But that particular thing, possibly one could, what you just said, possibly one could formalize it in terms of what Peter suggested in his paper for his intervention, as there being two legs on which Carnival does stand. One is the official culture, another is the popular culture. And therefore, I think one of the limiting cases of a carnival would be when there is a contradiction between the two, and an antagonistic contradiction between the official culture and non-official culture. In other words, official culture wants to ban or abolish non-official culture on which the particular festival or carnival is based, or perhaps non-official culture in the form of a rebellion eats up the official culture, abolishes it, by its own sort of eclat, so to say. But I would like to come back to Keith. Keith, what was your question? Was it a question trying to seek conditions, or try to understand what would be, try to ask us to define what would be the limiting cases of a carnival? In other words, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions under which a carnival terminates or becomes another? And if this is the question, then it obviously should be dealt with in two respects. One is purely historical, that these are the historical conditions in which we know carnivals to have stopped, or whatever it is, been transformed. And the other is the logical conditions. And I think, well, historical cases would be just a question of sort of going through the history books and our particular repertoires and totting them up, that under this at such and such time, certain carnivals declined or went off the record or something, or became other carnivals. I think the logical conditions are something that we can all discuss together, that under these conditions, carnivals had terminated or had been transformed, like the one that Professor Ranjit and Peter were suggesting, that this question of contradiction developing between official culture and non-official culture, and one of them swallowing the other. But there may be other occasions when I think when other conditions which one can logically lay down, when a carnival would stop or would become a different one.
That's an interesting question which I would like to just a very rapid tentative answer to, and that is that the highly organized urban carnivals of Italy were the kind least likely to get out of hand. That it's the much more informal, local, rural rites of inversion which present danger. But I wonder, I think Julian Pitt-Rivers would like to offer a few general comments, partly to round off his paper, and partly better to draw together some of the threads we've just been talking about.
No, sorry, Keith. I'm just interested in a fact. I did not hear the evidence by which you assumed this. Terry has kept asking the same question, and I haven't heard the answer. You just said they're highly organized, but Peter, who did the paper, hasn't said so, and I don't get I don't have the ethnography of or the sociology of these things yet.
Peter is far more about than I do. The reason, my impression is that these were tourist spectacles. Rome and Venice were tourist cities after all, at least in the 16th century. And they also were very expensive. They must have involved investment of a kind which has its parallels in New Orleans today.
Well, no. Let's not. Terry keeps coming back to a very, very interesting case here. That is that he's described in bits and pieces, and I'm sure in the book, if I had been literate enough to read it, where people are organizing themselves into corporations. These are corporations which are not just contingent things. They have a life. They have an internal structure, and so on. And he keeps asking for some detail on the Renaissance Italian ones, and I hear silence. Is it there is no evidence, which is a good answer.
I think it is actually.
Or somebody is hiding some things from
I'm certainly not hiding anything.
Masking. Okay, all right. So it's just really a problem of the sources.
I thought you said there were a great number of policemen in Rome at that time. Therefore, I mean, there was this element of somebody must be meeting danger. I mean, one thing that struck me on a number of ceremonies of this kind that one is attended, that very often there are rather special taboos or prohibitions of one kind or another to create an extra measure of peace, as it were. I mean, people are fearful of these things sort of going out of bounds. I don't want to become Turnerian, and I have it. There's a worry about the thing. And I'm reminded, actually, of the... it may have been the rights you're referring to of Bosman in the 17th century, if that was the author, who spent instead a considerable time in Ghana, I think 15 years on the coast. and the place where he was mostly at, Mina and so on, was noted for the Asafo parades at different times of the year. Now, looking through the colonial records on this, they're constantly referred to as the Asafo riots. And the colonial authorities were dead scared. They sent various district commissioners to write reports. We've got very good reports now. But these parades with these companies, admittedly they were sort of military companies in a sense, I mean they weren't simply fishmongers' guilds and so on, parading through the streets, were times of great tension to the colonial authorities, who classified all these parades as riots there if anything got out of hand, and were desperately afraid that something was going to break through at that particular time. Well, the boundary was very close between a rebellion, as they saw it, against colonial authority and the actual procession.
And that is the 12th of July situation, isn't it?
I mean, can I just say that Natalie Samuel Davis does talk about associations with her abbeys of misrule. Now, I'm not literate enough to know whether these are connected with Carnival or not, but...
Well, they sometimes are, aren't they? And they organised it in Law, as I remember. No, I thought surely fraternities are commonly concerned in organising spectacle and
Yes, but what we've got are just tantalisingly brief references that either crafts or regions of the city helped organise, but nothing financial. I haven't had the luck to happen on anything like Natalie Davis in terms of accounts for this kind of thing. But that's the area where there's ignorance. But as on the public order thing, there are literally hundreds of papal decrees issued just before Carnival showing that the Pope is normally very worried that the thing might develop into a riot. And in 1609 and 1709 in Rome it did. In each case, what they did was to travesty a Jewish funeral and then take it into the ghetto area, and fighting broke out. But perhaps relatively speaking...
Was Carnival associated with pogroms at all?
I haven't ever found an example. And I've never heard of anybody dying from the stoning they got when they were racing. And certainly nothing more spontaneous than that.
Well, was the papal bulls Day Spectacular this week really concerned with bullfights, weren't they, too?
A good many of them are. Masked men must on no account carry any kind of weapon, not even a stick. This kind of thing they reiterate.
That's punitive.
But all these cases are sort of, in a sense, penal terminations. That somebody comes in and stops the carnival as being undesirable or something, a higher authority. Is there any case? I think that's one of the conditions, of course. You see that one of the stools under one of the feet is taken away, the official culture of the other one. But the other case could be that a carnival becomes totally transformed. And becomes another carnival, another festival, another something else, another ritual act, to the extent that its former existence is totally exhausted, and it is, in a sense, reincarnated. And this would be a case of code switching, basically. It will be code of, frankly speaking, a translation, act of translation. There is a game, children's game, in which in Bengali you can turn the word Goru, which means cow, into Gadha, which means ass, simply by shifting the morphemes. Goru, Garu, Gadha. Goru means cow, Garu means a jug, Gadha means an ass. Now, very often in translation this happens. Jacobson has a very interesting study of translations in which he shows how on basic sets of words, English and Russian have used different verbal symbols. As a result, you can go on producing the wrong translation in the sense by shifting the meaning just minimally, wee bit, over a whole range of words, until for the same sentence you get a totally different meaning in another language when you do the translation. Now, I have a feeling that, if we can call this code switching, it's certainly one form of code switching. There may be other forms of code switching. Does this kind happen in your case? In other words, if your carnival if you go on putting in new components to it, coming either from the official culture or, let's say, non-official culture, until the whole thing is transformed, also becomes different in its major components to the extent that the people to whom the carnival is addressed, they will recognize it as a different message or a different or something belonging to a different code. I mean, there are cases in Indian political movement when code switching was tried and this failed. I mean, the famous cases of the Ganesh festival and the Rakhi Bandhan festival. I mean, it's a very vital phase of Indian nationalist movement. I have that particular historical example of an attempt at code switching that failed in my mind. But I have a feeling that this is the second kind of condition under which a carnival might terminate. And then that you have the same kind of example from your department.
May I take you back to the question of the symbols of Carnival and their meaning, which the second part of my paper was concerned with, although I didn't spell out very much. And I became concerned in between our first meeting and the present to try and see what more I could say. And certainly, if my data were thin at the time that I investigated this, looking back, it seems to me that I can understand greatly more than I did at the time with the aid of subsequent studies of that festival. So I would like just to take you round a quick look at how the problem has been approached by three authors, at any rate. First of all, Gagne's study seems to me to be a mixture of Margaret Murray, Steph Thompson and Sir James Fraser, with a spoonful of Jumézil and a faint, distorted echo of Lady Strauss. And I don't think it's a very good mixture. Gagné, despite his simplistic historicism and his notion of a religion of Carnival, whatever that means, he seems quite to have failed to justify it to me. The explanation of the connection between Candlemas and Carnival, which seems to me far-fetched. In fact, it seems to me that any old historical precedent somewhere serves him to elaborate a hypothesis which is mainly a matter of selective guesswork. And if I may quote from Elizabeth Bott, what one should not do, either with a dream or a ceremony, is plunge headlong into arbitrary interpretations of symbolism. It seems to me that this lesson is much needed in the case of Gagné. Nevertheless, there are certain associations in his book which are worth retaining and thinking about. The question of the associations of the bear, the horse, and the broad beam, and bladders, which are all explained in terms of their relationship to farting. But I cannot help thinking that there are additional explanations which ought to be borne in mind. The importance of the bear as being like a man, only savage, half man and half beast, therefore a bestial version of man, seems to be perhaps even more important than his famous fart, dehibernization fart, which gives him his place in Carnival for Gagné. And even so, farting, as important as it may be in Carnival, nevertheless has more significance to my mind than a means of getting rid of the soul through the back passage. It seems to me that the point about farting is that it is the perfect form of nonsense language, and nonsense language is something that is associated by many authors with Carnival. In fact, Payset, the famous Petoman, of whom a biography was published about 10 years ago, who, if you remember, a great musical actor of the beginnings of the century, who was able, apparently, to make comprehensible speech through his perfect control of his sphincter, and even to play the Marseillaise, a bugle inserted through a heart-shaped incision at the appropriate place. Basically, the better one, the whole point about farting is that it is the perfect nonsense language. It makes noise, but it is non-communicative noise. What we must remember also is that this is the time for the violation of taboos, and those which forbid farting are not the only ones. There are others which concern sphincter control, which is, after all, the person that the baby learns, and the nightshirts with brown patches painted over the backside are associated with farting, obviously, but give it a rather different sense. It is the violation of the taboo to behave like a civilized person that is involved. And again, when we come to deal with the association of horns, it seems to me that Ganyabe is saying something which is not entirely wide of the mark, but nevertheless there is more to be said. Butchers, cuckoos, coaches, cocks, and the horny moon are indeed drawn together around this notion of cuckoldry. But is it not only to be expected that the festival of women is also the festival of cuckolds? For if women suffer under the authority of their menfolk, it is not an authority without limits, for it is precisely in the Mediterranean, in the power of women, to destroy men's honour through their conduct, and not vice versa. Well, so much for Ganyabe. Carlo Baroja's demonstration of other fiestas using the same symbolic elements is important to show, and the point has been made already among us this afternoon, that there is a kind of common treasury of elements used in festivals, and that Carnival, in the extreme form of the inversionary rite, is liable to be borrowed from a whole number of other festivals in the Spanish cycle. Swings, bonfires, both of them associated with St. John particularly, but also with other fiestas, and bladders. There's an account of Cairo of a dance of bladders in a Basque village, but associated with the patron saint St. Stephen, and not with Carnival. Once more, Ganyabe seems to have picked out what suited him on many occasions, including the association with bulls. The bulls on a cord appear not only in Cairo's work in connection with Carnival, but we must remember that it appears on all sorts of other occasions. In the village of Macfarlane, it was associated with the Virgin of Carmen, which occurs in August. Also, we should perhaps remember that the bullfighting season opens in Spain with the corrida on Easter Sunday. So that we have to remember that this kind of treasury of symbols is used on a whole number of other occasions. Now, Cairo adds a rich documentation, not only in his book on Carnival, but elsewhere, and it seems to me that one of his lessons is very generalized like Ganyabe. Each carnival is a performance, discrete and particular to a community, and it is also part of a total annual cycle. So that we need to sort out the geography of Carnival, taking what is particular to each representation of Carnival and seeing it in terms of the annual cycle of that particular community. For the same elements are often found transposed, as in the examples I have already given, including the reign of the Lady Maryses of Sumaramala, or the dancing devils of Almonacid, which we haven't seen in the films because that particular film didn't come, I think, unlikely. Cairo's particular, what I might call his theoretical prudence, if not timidity, which even takes him so far as to suggest that really it is altogether too daring to speculate regarding the significance of such rituals is perhaps excessive to my mind, though with the documentation such as he furnishes, there is food for thought when we come to make any generalizations, because, as in the case of those of Ganymede, perhaps too easily exposed. Nevertheless, with the sufficient documentation, one starts to worry about whether what one says can, in fact, stand up. Now, the third author I'd like to take is Lévi-Strauss, of course, whose subtlety and whose system allows him to be able to juggle with his structures in such a way that there are jolly few hooks he can't get off. But let us remember that he does so with a kind of logic running the whole way through, which differentiates him very much from the arbitrariness of Ganymede. He points most usefully, in my mind, to many other features of symbolic systems. And I'm referring mainly here not to the paper of his, the little paper on Father Christmas, but to the treatment of the Charivari in the Mythologique, mainly in the first two volumes, only one or two references after that. And he points to the symbolical significance of food and noise, the symbolical association. In fact, all systems of opposition deriving from the senses, he suggests, are to be seen as a totality within which equivalencies can be established and out of which structures can be built out of the oppositions. He uses the expression sensorial codes, and you can see how this fits into his general theoretical approach. You can find these equivalencies, which are sometimes also inverted, when we move through his well-known technique of transformation from one context to another. We find suddenly an association is split and the elements are being placed in opposition. Now he's concerned with the Charivari, which is the same as the Vito in Spanish, and in particular in Grazalema, which he likens to the rather similar noises made on the occasion of an eclipse of the sun or moon in other parts of the world. Both customs draw attention, he suggests, by the noise they make, to an anomaly in the unfolding of the syntagmatic chain, the alternation of night and day, sun and moon, in the case of the eclipses, or the proper relations between the sexes in the instance of the Charivari. Now, Lévi-Strauss says very little about Carnival, in fact, although he says a great deal about Lent. And I would suggest that the association between the Vito and Carnival is absolutely fundamental, because the tenor of the occasion is the same sort of things are done, but one is in relation to an historical event, a scandal which is armed within the community and which may be dealt with by a Vito at any time of the year, and that kind of collective, regular Vito which occurs at Carnival. And I see that Barney Cohn's objection is most useful to me here, because one might liken this distinction to the distinction between those mortuary rites of famous kings who change everything, in contrast to the regular temporarily spaced rites, and the Vito used to desecrate, desacralize a certain member of the community, of the small rural community, as a result of a particular event. So that what you have said, Barney, has been of use to me in seeing in perspective this relationship, and I think there's probably more to be said about the relationship between the particular historical event and the regular course of the syntagmatic chain, which gets interrupted by the eclipse. But we might add to what Lévi-Strauss has to say, since he does not apparently see the connection between Vito and Carnival, that noise is what punctuates time and divides it up on a regular basis, as well as on the occasion of anomalous historical events. I would point to the use of guns fired in salute on these historical occasions that Barney Cohn has mentioned, but also those skyrockets, bells, etc., which are used in rites of regular temporal passage. There is nothing remarkable then about the fact that Carnival should use the same noise-making techniques as the Vito, and should indeed resemble it in so many other ways. It is a kind of fixed collective Vito, dividing up the year. And since other fiestas divide up the year if they are important, it is not surprising that they are borrowed from the customs of Carnival on these other occasions. But Lévi-Strauss also points to the connection so often encountered between noise and filth. For do we not ourselves talk about making a filthy row? And in this connection he has some interesting things to say about bells and those alternative instruments employed when bells are forbidden, a point we haven't brought up this afternoon. And he talks about les engins des ténèbres, the noise-making instruments of darkness, which are used precisely during Holy Week when bells may not be rung. But unfortunately he does not consider that these tenebrous instruments are also the same that are employed in Carnival. They are, it appears to me, instruments that are noise rather than music, and they contrast with the pure musical sound of the bell, whose note is musically identifiable. They are, in fact, tin cans, saucepans, rattles, whistles, gourds, drums, and the friction-making drum, the thambomba, that appears incidentally in Broider's picture, that terrifyingly obscene instrument that emits a noise like a series of farts and is operated through an action like masturbation. Lévi-Strauss does not take up this opposition in the musical world, but which seems to me very important, the opposition between noise-like pseudo-music and true music associated with the purity of the bell. But he does have something to say about the relation between musical instruments and food. I find his commentaries enormously valuable for pointing to the mode of interpretation, though when we come to the detail of Carnival, he seems to be saying something that does not always quite fit our facts, although I feel that they could be, and further examination should be able to justify them to some extent. For example, he has much to say about the fundamental antipathy between noise and cooking. And this looks rather anomalous in the case of Carnival, because are not these pseudo-musical instruments precisely what are used during Carnival, which is the festival of eating? And this may be all very well in the mythology of South America, but Carnival is distinguished precisely by gastronomical excess and by its noise, in opposition to Lent, which is the period of silence and abstinence. But I can see how Lévi-Strauss would get himself off the hook this time, because it is true that one of the ways of making noise that I have not mentioned, that is there all over the place in the records, is that it was made by breaking cooking pots. You smash the pot, and this is one of the ways of making noise. So that ultimately, if it is a period of culinary excess, it is also the end of cooking, and the pots are broken as one of the features of the noise. Now, the symbolism of food is most important, perhaps, and we haven't gone into that very much. But fat food versus lean food is very much all there in Carnival. Pigs associated with gluttony and with fat, and fish associated with thin, fair vague, after all in French, means to eat fish, not meat. And the abstinence of Carnival is associated with eating fish. But fish again is a symbol of great importance and has many other aspects. For there is, after all, to begin with, that particular association between Christ and fish, the ichthys god, and his ichthys associations is borne out in this opposition between the pig and the fish. So that is the relation of the Eucharist to red meat, prohibited because it resembles the literal flesh of a man, i.e. cannibalism, what counts in the case of this opposition? Or is it because fish is the association of the ichthys god, and as we approach the sacrifice of God, we move over to fish? Or, in any case, after all, the traditional association is between bread and the body of Christ in a whole number of customs, and not merely Holy Week, but the customs of Andalusia, making the cross over the bread, and all sorts of taboos about the handling of bread, which must be broken once it is distributed, and must not be touched with a knife, and so forth, and lots of others I won't go into, which way up its place and all that. So that we have the food which resembles Christ being above all bread. And Ganyebe has a little detail about unleavened bread rather than leavened bread of the host, which is associated with leavening it yourself. I think he's being rather excessive once more. He works out a literally and figuratively flatulent theory on this subject. But it seems to me that the fact that bread is always Christ gets him into difficulties. Now, in contrast to all these symbolisms of food, we can also see that pigs, to take up the notion of cannibalism, are particularly the sort of meat which should be associated with cannibalism, because as the proverb, the Spanish proverb says, if you wish to see your body, i.e. your anatomy, kill a pig, because the pig's body is thought to be identical to the human body. And therefore it is quite appropriate that pig meat should be associated, and all the pig symbolism fits in with Carnival and is going to be cut short at the end of Carnival. Incidentally, a little curious detail which puzzled me a great deal until I found it in Cairo's book, Goya's famous burial of the sardine, which is the end of Carnival, and he doesn't say too much about it. He does say that it has been suggested that sardina referred, in fact, not to the fish at all, but to a certain part of the pig's anatomy. Nevertheless, by Goya's time, apparently, it has reverted to its literal sense. Now, finally, I would like to say a word, if I may, if I'm not going on too long, if you can give me another few minutes, something about how can we explain change. Lévi-Strauss has given us in his analysis of Christmas some hints about changes that have taken place, how the Lord of Misrule was transformed into a Father Christmas, the chief of the youth into the old man with the beard, the apostle of misconduct into the rewarder of good conduct, aggressive adolescents have become spoiled children, the festival of license with adults held to ransom by children has been moved once more backwards from Christmas to Halloween. And such changes can only be explained within the total structure and changes within it. But to grasp this total structure would require much more data than I think we have. We would need ideally detailed descriptions of all the carnivals of an area to control the spatial transformations which I suspect existed in the same way as transformations of myths are to be explained by local oppositions. So were we to have all this data, we might be able to go round an area and see how certain details have been changed with regard to their place or transformed with regard to their value through a system of transformational grammar which Lévi-Strauss uses on his myths. So we need not just, also, in order to understand this symbolism, we need not just the folkloric elements, a bear, a horse, or a mask, but all the gestural, verbal, and choreographic detail. And the films can bring us infinitely richer data here, but alas, only for the present. And we must work out our structures in terms of these. Now, there was one which wasn't brought up when we were talking about masks just now. It seems to me very, very important. The contrast between the masks of Carnival, which Jack Goody suggests, are in fact not really masks. They don't hide the identity of the person, because you can tell him from his boots like a policeman in plain dress. They are perhaps, as Peter Bourke suggested, disguises which have as much significance for the person himself and the role into which he projects himself than they do for the public who sees him and who may in fact be able to identify him. But there is a big difference between the masks of Carnival and those masks which we saw in Caro's film, those black masks of the penitents, because they really do disguise you. And if you see them in Seville, a procession, 300 people long, all wearing identical dress, covered down to their feet and with this great hood with nothing but two eyes, you really cannot tell your best friend, unless he pops into a tavern to get a quick drink and pulls his mask out while he's sitting it down, which is done from time to time by the rather irreligious penitents. But the important thing is that if there is anything, this distinction between true disguise and false disguise, it is between Carnival's disguises and disguises of penitential processions and Holy Week, where people are masked. But there is another point, I think, which has to be made here. If the disguises of Carnival are taking on a false identity, a role which you play, the masks of Holy Week are taking on a non-identity which is much more appropriate to the role of the penitent rather than to the role of the ebullient violator of taboos who is represented in Carnival.